One.
Hello and welcome to our 2024 Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series. To paraphrase James Baldwin, nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is certainly true of the inequities that have historically shaped the entertainment industry and other digital media fields, both on screen and behind the scenes. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here in Storrs, Connecticut, is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, who have stewarded this land through the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Today's event, Comics, Historiography, and Creative Practice, will feature a presentation and discussion with our guest, Rachel Williams, followed by a Q&A that will also feature questions from the virtual audience. And yes, virtual audience, please take advantage of the YouTube chat box to submit questions for our guest, which we will try to answer during the discussion. I'm Clarissa Seglio, a U.S. cultural historian trained in the interdisciplinary field of American studies, and I work at the intersections of museum studies, public history, and digital humanities. Digital media and design is a young department here at UConn, founded in 2013, which has rapidly grown to over 350 undergraduate and graduate students and 25 full-time faculty. We have 7 undergraduate concentrations across the full digital media spectrum: film production, animation, interactivity, business, and the humanities, at both our Storrs and Stanford campuses. In our department, we value and celebrate our students' diverse backgrounds, and we support their development both as individuals and as professional media creators. Now in its 4th year, the Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker series is one celebration of these shared values. Now it is my extreme pleasure to welcome today's co-hosts, DMD students, Victoria Westline and Josh Robinson. Victoria Westline is a junior in digital media and design with a concentration in web and interactive media. Her passions include web development, mobile app design, and interaction design. Some of her work, which you can access in the links being added to the screen, includes mobile app design, interactive websites, and web-based experiences.
Thank you for having me here.
Also, Josh Robinson. He embarked on his creative journey as a student at the University of Connecticut in fall 2021. He is now a junior in the BFA program and has a concentration in digital film and video production. Josh has developed a broad skill set and involves himself in a variety of creative and technical fields, including photo and video editing, photography, art, game design, and even animation, as you'll see from the links to his work.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's guest, Rachel Marie Crane Williams. She earned a BFA in painting and drawing from East Carolina University, an MFA in studio art, and a PhD in art education from Florida State University. Prior positions include being a full professor and department chair at the University of Iowa in gender, women's, and sexuality studies, and the School of Art and Art History. Currently, she is the Dean of Liberal Arts at the UNC School for the Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She is the creator of 2 graphic historiographies, Elegy for Mary Turner, an illustrated account of a lynching from Verso Press, and Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, the Detroit Uprising of 1943 from UNC Press and the Duke Center for Documentary Studies. She has worked in communities and prisons for over 25 years. Her work as an artist is grounded in narrative painting and illustration, and her images are heavily influenced by the natural world. As a scholar, she focuses on race and history, prisons, conflict, gender, and education. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. Should I share my screen and start? Okay.
Absolutely.
While I'm doing that, I want to say a special thank you to Sabrina Clayman, who is there. Let's see, it's asking me, I think this is the right thing. Is it showing up? Do you see it? Okay. Sabrina was my student at the University of Iowa and was in my comics class, and also, you know, she signed up as a peer mentor, but to be honest, we were co-teaching that class, and she is absolutely amazing, and a fantastic artist and designer and storyteller. So I have to say a big thank you to her and say that I'm so proud that she is at the University of Connecticut in the Digital Media and Design Department, and I am just thrilled to be invited to talk to you all tonight. So thank you so much. So I want to start off by sort of posing a question, which is, what is arts-based research? And I've got 2 quotes here. One is from Patricia Levy, and the other is from Tom Barone and Elliot Eisner. And it's really, I share these quotes only to contextualize what it is I do. So Patricia Levy defines it as a transdisciplinary approach to knowledgeable building that combines the tenets of creative arts and research contexts. And then Barone and Eisner define it as arts-based research was and is an effort to utilize the forms of thinking and forms of representation that the arts provide as a means through which, my computer is deciding to run my PowerPoint for some reason, as the means, as the means through which the world can be better understood, and through such understanding comes to an enlargement of the mind. And I share these with you all just to say that when I started my work as a researcher, arts-based research was a thing, but it really hadn't been defined in that way. You had artists doing art and you had scholars doing scholarship, and I always straddled those 2 spaces. So I also want to share sort of my definition of historiography. Some people get really confused about that, and it's really just the study of the writing of history and what have other historians written about things? How does it present our contemporary understanding events? Does what you find in the archive agree or change past history? So you might have heard the story that, whoever wins writes the history of what happened. And you'll find that when you dig a lot, especially as a historian, that there are actually lots of people who have written things. I shared this. This is one class of students that I took to the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women. You mentioned in the introduction, I've been working in prisons for a long time. I started in '94. And that was really the place where I learned to be an ethnographer. And that's really where my typical scholarship began. I did a lot of really heavy interviews with women who are incarcerated and women who identified as artists who were incarcerated. And through that experience, the door opened for me in terms of understanding how prisons are sort of represent and reflect who we are. This question of what are prisons for and what does it say about a society? And through that question, I was really led to bigger questions about race, about gender, about power, about patriarchy, about colonialism, and about violence. And so I would say, I just share this to say that I have been a scholar for decades, and over time, your curiosity about different questions will change, and that's also true when you're an artist. And so I think, leave that door open and give yourself a chance to really pursue your history of curiosity. I want to put this up here just to say that, I continue to practice as a painter, and I really find that painting is sort of where I go when I need to rejuvenate myself, refresh myself, get back in touch with who I am. When I want to tell stories, but I don't know what those stories mean yet, that's usually where I go to painting, because oftentimes my sort of creative mind will understand the story before my analytical, intellectual mind understands the story. And sometimes those two don't talk to each other, and I have to create it for it to sort of come out. So really, I've always sort of straddled this place between art and writing. I don't know why my computer is driving itself. And so the intersections of my work are around patriarchy, power, justice, place and time, and whiteness. I think centering myself as a white woman is pretty important, especially in the stories I'm going to tell. And really, for me, the changing point was when the movie American Splendor came out, and it's Harvey P. Carr, who's pictured here, was sort of the writer for this. And he had this idea that he would tell stories through comics. And that just was this moment when everything clicked into place for me. I was like, I can write, I can draw, I can tell stories. And comics seemed to be the perfect way to do it. This is an illustration that I did that talks about how comics work for qualitative researchers. And so, here I am, an embodied researcher. I can grasp all of these things that in writing would take pages and pages, but in a drawing take, hardly any time at all to sort of get very quickly. And I can send this image if people are interested, but it really does work as a wonderful vehicle. And I think comics and comic creators really do represent a wonderful branch of arts-based research. So, one of the questions that I've pursued is how can graphic text be used to effectively tell stories that matter and that generate new knowledge? And so I'm going to tell you the story of 3 works that I've worked on tonight. The first is Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed. And in doing that work, I also came across and connected to the story of Mary Turner. And then when I moved back to the Southeast and to North Carolina in particular, which is my home, I started really thinking a little bit more about change and about climate and environmental justice, and really how violence is happening environmentally in the Anthropocene. So I'm going to sort of work through the thread of those things. I have a lot of slides. So Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed is about the Detroit Uprising of 1943. And my friend Joe Parsons is responsible for turning me on to this. I had written a piece about what happened in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he said, if you're interested in those kinds of stories, you should look up Detroit. And I looked up Detroit, and I was just absolutely enthralled. And what really turned me on was the archives in the NAACP. And I read through those affidavits, and what I realized is that there were a lot of stories in those affidavits that hadn't been told. And the books that had been written were right after it happened in the 1940s by white male sociologists and criminologists. And then right after the 1967 event happened in Detroit, the uprising, same kind of situation. But the people who were left out of those stories really were women, and especially Black women. So I put this slide in here just to say, I want to share a little bit with you about my research process. And this might be a process that, might work for you as a person trying to figure out how to make art. It might not, but this is kind of what I do. I'm an avid reader, and often I feel like I have to read everything about something before I can write about it or make any work about it. So I, spend a long time reading. So these are the issues that led up to June 1943. And I also want to say that in order to make change in the present day, we cannot forget what happened in the past. And we also have to recognize that we live in patterns. And so many of the things that came up in 1943 are still present even today. So housing shortages, contested spaces, the war at the time and the double V for Victory Jim Crow campaign, the Arsenal of Democracy, which is the time when Detroit retooled from being the capital of sort of automobile making to the Arsenal of Democracy. So they began to engage in manufacturing processes to support the war. There was a lot of labor unrest, a lot of discrimination, especially against Black women and Black workers. I tell the story of the Ford Motor Company, the brutality and the complicated relationship that the Ford Motor Company, as one case study, had with the Black community and, you know, the union, and then a little bit about Harry Bennett, Ford's service department, really as a precursor to talk about sanctioned violence and state sanctioned violence, which was really police brutality, which was one of the themes that showed up in this a lot. So in listing those things, I hope you hear some things that might still be relevant and current today. So in the uprising, 34 people died, 25 were Black and 9 were white. 17 Black people were fatally shot by police. 675 people were injured. 2,000 people were arrested and detained by police. There were $2 million in property damage and millions of hours of labor lost. And many people, Detroit's a large city where the uprising happened was really concentrated in a particular part of Detroit. So there were people that didn't realize that these things were happening and they tried to go to work and then got caught up in these things. One of the things that's really important to me is the archive. And again, it's because within the archive, you find competing stories, and you also might find stories that haven't been lifted up and lifted out. And so Detroit is an amazing city. These are some of the archives I spent a lot of time in. Probably two of the most important were the Walter Reuther Archives of Labor at Wayne State, and then this is the Detroit Free Press, which was a newspaper that was dying. And I went into the photo area and she was like, there was one person running it. And she said, have at it. You can use anything you want, which was like phenomenal for an artist. And so this is an example of one of the things I found in the archive. Help the white people keep this district white. Men are needed to keep our lines solid. Come to Nevada and Finland Sunday and Monday. We need your help. Don't be yellow. This is World War II, so that's a slur. Come out. We need every white man. We want our girls to walk the street, not rape. So this one flyer really details a long history of white supremacy and storytelling to promote violence within our country. And these themes, I share this with you. It is horrifying just to sort of say that these things come up over and over and over. And they also come up in the next story I'm going to talk about. So these are just some examples of images and things that I found in the archives. This is a letter, obviously, from the NAACP from Walter White. To Walter White, and Walter White figures prominently in my research, and his work in Detroit led me back to 1918 and the work he was doing at that point in time. So he is really a through line for me in many ways. Here are some more images. These are all from the newspapers. And I think what you will see in these images, especially these large crowd shots, is there's tons of women there. And that does not appear in the sort of formal record. And the story that does get told about what happened in 1943 really is very particular and constructed in a particular way. So after I figured all that stuff out, after I read everything, went to archives, and I sort of continued to do this, I had to really construct it and translate it. And anyone who's a historian will be horrified by my notebook, but I was sort of trying to lay it out with images, with quotes, with a timeline. It took me a long time. So this project took me 13 years. And it was really also about reconstructing Detroit, which had been destroyed by urban renewal, parts of Detroit, especially historical Black areas in Detroit. So Emily Koodle is an amazing artist and really an architect, I think. And she did this beautiful sort of resurrection of area photographs of an area in Detroit called Black Bottom, which is no longer there, but it was really figured prominently in 1943. So then I have to draw things, right? And, I have to figure out, like, what did cars look like? What did dresses look like? What were people wearing? This is a photograph from the Detroit Free Press. And this is kind of what my desk looked like. It was a mix of drawing, you know, ink. Of course, I drink a lot of tea, tons of books, lots of archival material. And so I would just sort of go back and forth in that soup. By the time I was done after 13 years, this is my dad's Bible. And it's basically the thickest book I owned. And, you know, I ended up drawing a ton of drawings. And of course, if you see the final book's not, it's about that big. So just, you know, for those of you that are interested in comics, by the time you get to the publication part, you've done so much drawing and so much of it you throw away. So I'm just going to go through, these are just a few of the drawings. And when I started this, it was published in 2021. So I think I started in 2008. Digital technology was not agreeable to me in terms of drawing. So I started off doing everything by hand and eventually did sort of begin to incorporate digital technologies. One of the other sources of inspiration is poetry, especially the poetry for me of Jim Daniels. He is a poet from that area and he writes beautiful things, and his poetry really brought things to life. So I want to say, as an artist, you know, there's many, many sources of inspiration. Place obviously also plays a huge role. And these are images of Detroit. I've been to Detroit many, many times, and it is a very particular place and a particular landscape. So I want to go back to this one photo here. This is a view from Belle Isle, and Belle Isle also figures prominently into this. And the poet Philip Levine wrote about Belle Isle, and his poem really moved me. And in fact, when I started this, he was alive, and he had said, of course you can use my poem. So these are some illustrations based on his poetry about Belle Isle that he wrote in 1949. And then this is sort of the final image in that series. And you can see, you know, at this point, I'm really using a lot of digital. But I did find lots of inspiration for images in poetry. I want to share this page quickly. This is really a combination of all of that stuff. So you've got the archival images, you know, on the Belle Isle Bridge. The violence began when a group of Black picnickers and white Navy fellas met on the bridge and started fighting. And this is actually really important because that's really the seed of where everything started. And Belle Isle, before it was Belle Isle, was basically called the Hog Island. And the idea was that they had put hogs on that island to eat all the rattlesnakes. And these are from buildings on Belle Isle. There's a series of different architectural pieces that are beautiful. And so this is sort of incorporating all of that into a page. This is the bridge, the Belle Isle Bridge, which is quite famous. If you go there, you'll see that. So that's kind of the way I worked. And then here's some images of, just very quickly, I'll go through this, different stories. One of the stories that came up is the Detroit Housewives League. Phenomenal group of activist women, very, you know, respectable, but also doing amazing social justice work. I could have written an entire book about the Housewives League, and I would encourage someone to do that. I also wanted to really say that Black and white communities, they were living parallel lives. People were working, they were loving, they were raising families, you know, they were trying to live, be, find joy and satisfaction. And so I really wanted people to understand that, you know, everyone is living their life and doing what they can do. And so it was really important for me to show lots of different kinds of images of people living together. And this is the story of a woman who is trying to convince her husband to unionize, and she's being pressured by other Black women in the community. And then this is the story of a woman who goes to a protest with the UAW and ends up on a bus being nearly beaten. So this is also another image. You can see the affidavits in the background of these two women. This woman was looking for her brother who was arrested, and this woman is looking for her son. Robert Parsons and Robert Gordon were together that evening. And so it's interesting to read their stories about those events and their experiences. And so I tried to really highlight that. And then here's another image. This is really about the mayor and the police commissioner and their failure to act. So, and you can see this is an image from Life magazine, and it basically says Detroit is dynamite. So they knew this was coming. So how did this lead to Mary Turner, Elegy for Mary Turner? So Elegy for Mary Turner, Walter White in 1918 goes down to Georgia, and he has just graduated from college, and he's sent down there by the NAACP to investigate a lynching. And so this is from the Tuskegee Institute, and they've basically mapped lynchings from 1900 to 1931. And you can see that they happened all over the country, but they're deeply concentrated, obviously, in the Southeast. And so that book is dedicated to all the women and children that were lynched. And you'll see in this list, there's X's. So some of these women endured these horrible violent deaths, and people didn't even care enough to record their names. So the Mary Turner Project was kind of a relief for me because I didn't have to do a lot of historical archival work. The Mary Turner Project had already done and continues to do that work. In this image, you will see the family of Mary Turner, and it's a real testament that despite what happened to her, she left a legacy of amazing people that continue to hold up her legacy so that people will never forget. And you'll see this sign right here, which is actually really important. This was erected in the site where she was lynched. She was part of a lynching spree where a group of white men, over the course of a few days, killed, 11 people. And she was pregnant at the time that she was killed. So what happens is that sign, even now, I took this picture, was shot at and had bullet holes and had been run over. So eventually it was taken down, and this was erected, which is a giant steel cross. So all that's to say is that this story continues to linger in this space and is still, there's still a lot of efforts to use power and fear to enforce ideas about white supremacy. This is a picture of Valdosta, Georgia. I bought a lot of different postcards. So this is from 1918, and this is very close to where she was killed. And they do talk about the Little River in stories about what happened. And Walter White's story is probably the most comprehensive account of the lynchings. And this is Pine Street in Valdosta. This is also a postcard from that same time period. And this is the river where it happened. And this is basically where this is. So it's outside of Valdosta in Hahira, Georgia. And the way this story came to me is I was really inspired by Helena Bakrakova-Ditrikova, who's a Czech artist. Her work was on display at the Women's Museum in DC. I also had letters that my grandmother had saved from that period of time. She was a huge, not my grandmother, my great-grandmother. She saved everything. And so the work of this artist who did graphic narratives that were wordless, and then the writing that I found in my grandmother's great-grandmother's letters really inspired me to do the text in this way with a dip pen in the way that someone would have written in 1918. This is 1916. I share this with all of you students at UConn to say he had just graduated from Atlanta. Walter White passed as white, and so he went down there pretending to be a white man, a traveling salesman, and he elicited from this person an account of the lynching and all of the people who participated as, murderers, which was very brave. And he took it back to the NAACP and demanded justice. This is an image from, I think it's from the Atlanta Constitution. I should have put that, but her talk enraged them. So basically, she was lynched because she spoke out about the lynching of her husband, who was innocent. And they came and got her very quickly after that, Hayes Turner. So these are some of the images. These were all linoleum cuts. And when I first did this, I didn't intend to use words. I intended to just use images. And it looked like a generic story of lynching. And it's very not generic. I wanted people to know that Mary Turner's story and the stories of the men who also died were very particular. And now my current work, where I know it's at 6 o'clock, but my current work is really about salt intrusion in coastal North Carolina. And that was brought about by agriculture and forestry and people's sort of adding these ditches, which has allowed salt water to come in, but it's been enhanced by climate change. And, you know, you may or may not know this, but the ocean is changing. This is a map from NOAA of flooding, what happens when it floods 3 feet, and all of these light blue areas basically go underwater. So this series is set right here. This is the Alligator River right here. And there is the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge here. So that's where this story is set. So I went and did a lot of work on the history of that. I have a dear friend who's a historian, Bill Barber, and his partner, Chris Barber, and they have both written a lot about this particular area, which changed drastically because of forestry and logging. And then it was also a hotbed during Prohibition. But prior to that, indigenous people had lived there. There were people who escaped enslavement who hid in that area as they traveled north to Virginia. So these are paintings I've done now, illustrations, and they really are about that history and also about climate change and agriculture, how agriculture has influenced that part of North Carolina. And they also really, again, are about history. So this is based on this myth of Virginia Dare, the first white child born in that area. And of course, she's memorialized, but there were many people and many children there long before there were settlers who really changed the face of that area and destroyed a lot of it. This is a close-up of a ditch. It's also the last place in the United States where there's a pack of wild red wolves. They're heavily monitored, but they were reintroduced, and they continue to live there. They don't thrive because of humans. And humans have interacted a lot with the animal species. This illustration has a story about possum hunting and how possum hunting and possum eating really became a spectacle for white supremacy. And that's a great story that's in Southern Spaces, a wonderful, there's a great, I've totally lost her name, wonderful historian who has written about that, and really about snakes and the geese. And then also the cypress trees and how the cypress trees are disappearing, and what is left in their place are ghost forests, which were not there when I was a young person. And that is due to salt intrusion. So all these trees are dying, and what's going to be left is marshland. And eventually that whole landscape is going to drastically change. So that's my work. This is my website. You can see it. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. And Joss and Victoria, take it away.
Okay, I'll kick this off. So my first question would be, just see, okay, yeah. As a volunteer arts and creative writing teacher in prison, you have seen firsthand the injustices of this so-called justice system that we have in America. What led you to speak out about correctional institutions through comics, graphic essays, and art? What was like the source of the involvement?
Mm-hmm. I would say really working with incarcerated people absolutely changed my entire view on quote unquote what justice is. You all probably know, because this has really become a well-known statistic. Our country incarcerates more people, you know, than any other place in the world, basically, and the conditions are horrendous. And I also want to say, you know, it says a lot about our humanity towards other people. And it also is really a sign of, one, racism, incredible gendered violence. There's also a lot of horrible intersections with disability, and especially with mental health disorders. And so I would say many of the people who I met who were incarcerated really were poor, didn't have good representation. You know, if their circumstances had been different in terms of race, identity, economics, they probably would have been in a different space. So I do think our justice system really lays bare, you know, the worst of us, you know, the worst parts of our quote unquote democracy. And I have this shirt on, it says vote. I want to encourage everyone that's watching tonight to register to vote and to vote. That's the only way we'll ever change anything. And I think that there's a lot we could do besides incarcerate people. And I think there's a lot of ways to think about justice and, you know, basically helping not only victims who have been horribly harmed, but also helping the people who caused that harm to make reparations in some way and rejoin society.
Thank you. That was a super powerful message.
So going off, our next question is how has working and interacting with incarcerated women in particular impacted the way you create art? And like, are there like any stories in particular that stood out to you or really impacted the way you like create art?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say when I started working with people who are incarcerated, I really thought of my studio practice and as a very separate thing from my teaching and my research. And I did not plan to spend my life doing research in prisons. I had planned to do museums because I was like, oh, I could do my research field sites, could be in New York and Italy and, wonderful places all over the world. But after working in there for 3 years, my dissertation advisor, Sally McRory, who I owe so many things to, kind of said, this is really your passion. When you talk, this is what you talk about. And for me, the first thing it changed was the way that I related to people and also taught. It was really the first time that I recognized that, like, as a teacher, you're really more of a facilitator, and everyone in that room plays the role of a teacher at different times. And the most important thing is to sort of say, what are your questions? What do you want to learn? What experiences do you already bring? And how can I, what can I bring to this? And how can we put those things together to create a space where we learn in the same space, we make meaning in the same space, and we, there's a reciprocal mutuality. And so I would say the first students with whom I worked in prison were so generous. They were all women. They were older than me, and they really took me under their wing, and they taught me a lot about teaching. I was teaching high school at the time, and it completely changed my approach. And it made me love teaching, like turned me on to teaching so much. So I loved it. I would also say as an artist, I kind of had this moment where I was like, Rome is burning. We are in ashes as a species, as humans. If we can do this to each other, something has to change. And I really felt called to make work that brought people inside with me. I mean, prisons are invisible. They are not meant to be places that the public thinks about. Often the last thing people see when someone has committed harm and becomes incarcerated is their mugshot and some awful news story. And what they don't realize is that life goes on. Life goes on for the victims, which is hard and painful. And life also goes on for the people who've caused harm, which is hard and painful. And many people get out of prison. Most people will get out and rejoin society. And so people don't realize when you go to Walmart and give someone your credit card, there's a decent chance that that person might have been incarcerated. When you go to Shake and Steak or you go to Dillard's or you go anywhere, there's a good chance you might be on a bus, you might be on a plane, you might be in the grocery line with someone who's probably been incarcerated. And so I think it's important to make visible those realities. These are great
That was a really great answer. Thank you. Yep.
To kind of build off talking about your experiences with incarcerated women, I wanted to know a little bit more about like how the students are impacted by taking your class that goes to the state prison. Can you recall any notable interactions or experiences that came from these situations and events?
Absolutely. And I have not taught a class like that in a really long time. And I'll be honest, COVID ended my work in prisons. The prisons in Iowa basically kicked out all of the volunteers. And as far as I know, ICIW has not let volunteers back in. And so it's much easier to run a correctional institution when you don't have people from the outside coming in and critiquing. And it's, it's hard to incarcerate 600 or 700 people and then have hundreds of volunteers coming in and out. So I can understand why they did it, but it's quite unfortunate. But I would say my students, I always said, you will be surprised because you are going to fall in love with these women. And I would always start by saying, what stereotypes do you have about people who are incarcerated? And then I would say, what stereotypes do you think people who are incarcerated have about college students? And it was really eye-opening for them. And, you know, there are many people who are incarcerated that have college degrees, graduate degrees, in fact. So I think that was one thing, is to challenge whatever stereotypes you've been programmed with. And also to realize that when you meet someone who has been incarcerated, you know, they are probably sober. They are probably, they've been taken outside of whatever life situation might have influenced what happened. It's not to say they're safe. I would not say they are safe. But I would say, you know, sometimes it's the first time they've had access to any health care. It's very poor health care, but it's something. And it's also, you know, it can be transformative. It's unfortunate that that can be transformative, and that there are many other ways people could be experience transformation besides being incarcerated. I'll never say that prisons are good, never, never. But I think for my students, it really made them rethink the justice system. It made them rethink concepts around identity. And it also really made them recognize that, like, again, we facilitated. So what it means to be a facilitator. And, you know, we talked about healthy relationships, domestic violence, sexual violence. And what made us do that class is realizing that most of the materials out there were not practical for a particular, you know, a whole population. And mostly, you know, when I say that, people who are deeply impoverished, that, you know, things like get an extra phone is not helpful. You know, make sure you have gas in your car is not helpful. So the women who are incarcerated really wrote their own manual, and they said, this is what I know from living that experience. So really, this idea of saying, we don't know what people need. People can solve their own problems and know what's best for themselves. And so, you know, how do you transmit that knowledge through, you know, groups of people? So we probably served, I would say, between 50 and 100 women every semester. And I'd always have about 10 to 12 students, and the students were remarkable. Always students are remarkable. They were incredible. And again, they taught me as much as, you know, I could ever teach them. So I learned a lot of my current pedagogy from my students, like Sabrina, and also from the women who are incarcerated, who many I continue to correspond with them. Again, many of them have gotten out, and I have to say, I despise Facebook, but one of the wonderful things is I can see them flourishing. I can see them having beautiful children, having jobs, getting degrees, having rewarding partnerships, and living beautiful lives, you know, moving on. And that's really gratifying. So
It's a really beautiful thing to share. Thank you.
thank you.
Going forward, kind of transitioning to another topic, with like your work, what would you say is like the most difficult aspect of creating work that's centered around social justice? And what do you find, even with all like the struggles of like creating this kind of work, what do you think is like the most rewarding aspect of this sort of work?
I would say, one, it's, you know, and I never want to say that doing this kind of quote unquote work is hard. It does psychologically take a toll, especially when I was doing work around lynching. That was really actually quite difficult to sort through those archives. And you know, people say, what do you want people to get from that book? It's a really dark and hard book to read, the Mary Turner book. And I always think about this poem that was written after World War II, and it's by Primo Levi, and he basically writes this beautiful stanza, and he says, it's a long thing, but he basically starts off by saying, you who live safe in your warm houses, you who find on returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces. He goes on, there's a couple more lines, and he says, reflect on the fact that this has happened. These words I commend to you. Inscribe them on your heart when staying at home and going out. And he goes through sort of people's inhumanity to one another. And so, you know, recognizing the fact that people have been horrendous to each other. I mean, I do think people are the worst animals. That people have been horrible to each other, been able to do and dehumanize one another in ways that result in death and terrible suffering. So that's difficult. I will say what's not difficult was, you know, her family came to one of my talks. I had reached out to them to say, I'm doing this. I would love to meet you. They were incredibly kind. There was something really amazing about being able to like hug her ancestors, and to see those spaces and to see that the traces of what happened are still there, but there's also hope that things might change. It's just important that we never forget that stuff. But I would say it's difficult. I would say physically it was difficult. I carved all those pieces. I ended up with like permanent nerve damage from doing that work. And so, you know, that might have been a little bit of my physical body reflecting my sort of mental state of mind. But it was an important story for me to tell. And I will say, Julie Armstrong is an amazing scholar. And if you really want to learn about what happened, I would read her book. And I would also look at the archives of the Mary Turner Project. They have done incredible work. And she's like one of my heroes. She's a phenomenal writer.
Thank you so much. It was like a really interesting perspective on that. Thank you.
So for the next question, we're kind of moving back to like your paintings. So upon browsing your website, I noticed that a lot of your paintings contain animals in nature. I found that snakes, birds, and rabbits seem to have a recurrent theme in many of them. Is there any significance to these specific animals? Like, what do they mean to you? Or have you created kind of a meaning for them, or what's the story behind that?
You know, really it's about proximity. I grew up, you know, outside barefoot in the woods all the time. And these are really the animals I saw the most. I had rabbits growing up. I have continued to have birds as an adult. And I love birds deeply. I am absolutely afraid of snakes. And where I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, there is a lot of snakes. And so it's kind of funny. They really wove themselves into my psyche. I sound like a crazy person, but when I get really stressed out or anxious, I have these crazy snake dreams. And so for me, they really represent a lot of, you know, and I don't want to ever ascribe evilness to any animal. Animals are not evil, and snakes are not evil. I am just afraid of them. So it's me, it's not them. I would never anthropomorphize snakes to be evil, but I do see them as sort of creatures with a very low, maybe set of empathetic impulses. I would say that, but you know, rabbits are easy to observe. They're everywhere. I also have to say I read Watership Down as a kid, and that really cemented rabbits in a particular place in my mind. And, you know, same with birds. So those are sort of why I draw those animals. I love to draw them. They're just fun to draw, but I also, you know, have been observing those animals my entire life. And dogs, I love dogs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So our next question was, what is the process like illustrating a graphic novel? And like more specifically, do you create the illustrations first or the text first? And what really goes on like in your creative process? And where does like your inspiration come from?
I would say there's no right way to do it. I think different people have really different processes, and I think it's really important to find your own process. For me, you know, it goes back and forth. Sometimes I start with images. So the Mary Turner Project appeared to me in images immediately. I would say the Detroit Project was really word-based. You know, I really started off writing that script, that, you know, the story and the narrative, and then I illustrated it. So that was a really different process. The last pieces I showed you, that set has started off as images, and really trying to understand what I'm working on by doing those images first. And then, you know, a lot of it comes back to like, the more you read, the more you find, the more depth there is. And so you just sort of stew in it, you know, it's kind of like tea. It just gets sort of stronger and richer in your mind. And again, reading and history, you know, are really two of my main sources of inspiration. I would also say poetry holds a huge place in my heart, and really the work of scientists. I am so enamored with scientists. I think if you want to talk about people doing social justice work, our scientists are doing phenomenal things, and they're oftentimes they fly under the radar, they're quiet, they're humble people, but they are really doing amazing things. And so I think it's really up to humanists to tell those stories and invoke the work of scientists in that work in terms of data.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely, yeah, I agree with that.
So one of the things that I was very intrigued upon doing research of your work was your extensive CV. What is one piece of advice that you would share with college students regarding how to approach the job process and how you got involved in all these things throughout your life?
Sure. I would say I'm an extrovert. I'm a huge extrovert. I absolutely love people. And I also like to be really, really busy. And so I say yes, sometimes to my detriment, a lot. And I would say in saying yes to things, you meet people, you find new things. I never would have guessed I would end up being so intimately involved in prisons. I honestly volunteered to teach one summer. I had a professor who had a gig with the Department of Corrections, and I said, I'd love to volunteer. She was an art person. She was a musician. And she said, oh, yeah, you could do that. And I totally thought I would be helping with literacy. I don't know what I thought I would be doing, but just saying yes and volunteering changed my life. And I really am a huge proponent. If you have the space in your life, we don't always have money, but we do have time. And so how do you spend that time? And I think, even at that point in time, I was a graduate student. I was working. I always worked 2 or 3 jobs, and, you can make time in your life for things. And I think if you have that ability to do it, to do it. So I think volunteering, saying yes, being open to people. I'll talk to anyone, and I can't tell you how many conversations and interesting discussions I've had with people that I didn't know and that I ended up becoming deep friends with because I was just open. So I would just say be open. You just never know where things will lead you. I will also say, though, it's okay to say no. And that's the other side of it, is to be able to say no to the things that really don't turn you on. So, follow your bliss. If it makes you excited, do it. Don't worry about where it's going to end up. It'll all work out, hopefully.
That's really great advice. Thank you.
Not really. It's kind of generic.
It works.
Also another question going kind of on the topic of career paths and things like that. Reflecting like on your specific career journey, who are like the individuals across various disciplines who've played like the most significant roles in like shaping and guiding your path on like where you are like today, you think?
I mean, I would honestly say teachers have always been a huge part of, my life and making me recognize things, that I do well or could do well, or paths that I could take. I would say I basically can name all the teachers I had growing up, and I had some amazing public school teachers. I would also say I had some phenomenal professors. I've also just had some really wonderful people in my life who have been kind and mentored me, and have taken time to talk with me. I mentioned Julie Armstrong. When I started doing Mary Turner, I read her book and I thought, well, I'm just going to write to her. And I wrote to her, and she was incredible. Same with, Detroit. I had a number of people that I worked with and wrote to and said, can you tell me about this? Can I meet with you? I would say Tim Tyson is someone who I very deeply admire. He's a historian, and he really got me interested in history. Leslie Schwam, same thing. I could just go on and on, but really, I've had so many people in my life who have been incredibly kind. Steve McGuire, who spoke a few weeks ago, is probably one of the biggest mentors in my life in terms of, kind of showing me what it means to be an artist and to be a creator and to be a great teacher. I've also had, I would say, if you are a teacher, your students will give more to you than you ever give to them. So, I think about Sabrina's a great example. I had a student, Rebecca McCrae, who's the one that made me think, oh, I could bring students into, these spaces with me. I had, Wendy Miller was my student. She's now my mentor in art education. Like I've had so many phenomenal and amazing students and people. I've also had great friends. I would say that's the other advice I would give you, is to treasure your friendships. I had a dear friend, Jeffrey Palermo, who went with me and volunteered in the prisons with me for a decade. And working with her, she was trained as a social worker and a substance abuse counselor, turned my way of thinking inside out. I worked with a dear friend who is a family marriage therapist, Jacob Priest, also changed the way I thought about things. So, your friends can really guide you and open up different worlds for you.
Thank you for your answer. Yeah.
Okay, so this last question. You mentioned that it took you 13 years to finish your project. What was it like to finish that piece of work? What were your emotions like after spending so much time with this project? What did it feel rewarding? What was kind of your thought process?
It took me so long because I had two little kids. And I'll tell you, as an artist, my studio was a piece of plywood under my bed with, bottles of ink and paintbrushes and taped down papers ready to paint on for decades. And, I became a single mom, and that really made it difficult. I'll be honest with you. My children were my priority in my teaching. But I would leave it and then come back to it and leave it and come back to it. And I would be encouraged to come back to it by my editor, who began as Joe Parsons and then ended up being like amazing people at the University of North Carolina Press. It really pushed me they kept saying, this is a really important story. And I'll be honest with you. I was finishing that up right as sort of a number of police murders happened. And prior to that, I had worked with the Hull House and Miriam Kaba to do some zines about police violence. And, I could really see that like people are interested in history right now. What does this mean? When has this happened before? How do we think about these things? And I was kind of like, I do need to finish this story. This is really important. And I'll tell you, I finished it. I didn't feel any kind of way about it. My editor said, you have to do footnotes. And I threw a 3-year-old fit on the floor and said, I can't do footnotes. I can't do this. I don't want to do this. Because I had just those messy journals. I was like, I've been so many places. I don't know where I found this piece of things. Real historians are incredibly organized people. And they keep these beautiful note cards and they keep a careful record of where they got things and where they've been. And I am more like, a person with 2 plastic bags filled with God knows what. So, I almost said, I don't want to do this at that point. And then they encouraged me and I finished it. So it was incredible to be done with it. And really, I felt like I was really done with it after 13 years. So,
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
Thank you so much. Just so many light bulbs going off for me as a historian as I think about your work. And thank you for giving historians so much credit for being organized. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, only speaking for me. Oh, and I see that we have an audience question. So we had promised our audience that we would integrate their participation. So before we close out, let me get that question. So I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Mariame, who has asked, thanks for this presentation and your great work. Who do you envision as the audience for your work?
And I think that depends on which piece, and I would say the Detroit book is really dense. When I think about that book, I think about people who are interested in comics and interested in history. There's a lot of people who live in Detroit that have no idea that happened. And so I would say, that audience is going to be a very particular group of people. I would say the Mary Turner book is quite different. When I think about the Mary Turner book, I often think about white people as that audience and people who are really at this moment in time thinking that, history's happened, we should move on, we should gloss over, we should forget things. So people right now, there are a lot of people who are talking about critical race theory and, that's a whole discussion, but I don't think we should ever forget that we are capable of doing these kinds of things. And so when I think about the audience for the Mary Turner book, I really am interested in people recognizing just the depths of horror that we have fallen to in this very country in terms of police brutality, in terms of vigilante justice, in terms of white supremacy, in terms of patriarchy. And just to realize that those things still continue to have echoes in the current day. There are Black women who are still killed, and in all kinds of ways. I mean, even when I think about infant mortality, if you are a Black woman and you are getting ready to give birth in this country, your chances of dying or that your child might die during that process are quite high, especially considering what kind of medical apparatus we have in this country. It's shocking. So I would say we are still a country where there is great divisions built on very harmful notions around race and around wealth is the other thing. And so I would say my audience for that particular book is really anyone who wants to read it, but in particular, I would say white audiences. And people often say that's African-American history, and I say, no, that's everybody's history. And if we are ever going to be free, liberated, and humane to one another, we have to recognize what's happened, how we got to here even, and that it's so easy to move back into those old patterns. And, you can see it right now. There's genocide happening all over the world.
Absolutely. And without the presence of the white racists and oppressors, African-American history would have a completely different shape. And so to remind us that the history that has transpired and has unequally, particularly through oppression, been shaped, and is so critical to how we see this as American history. Thank you again. It's difficult to end an evening when the talk and conversation have been so vital, informative, and inspiring, and calling on us as human beings to be more humane and to think about how our various disciplines and work can bring greater humanity into our daily interactions and into our media. So thank you very much, Rachel Williams, for being here with us this evening, for being so generous and sharing your experience, advice, and insights into your process. Thanks also to our co-hosts, Victoria and Joss. And it's been a rare treat to have our event producer, Sabrina Clayman, on screen with us tonight. She's typically behind the scenes, and I encourage you to check out the links that are being posted to the chat to get to know her work as a mixed media storyteller who explores narratives that foster human connections through kindness and nostalgia, through themes of memory, grief, and change. Everyone online is invited to join us again next Wednesday, April 24th at 5:30 p.m. for our final Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design speaker of the 2024 season, Cinque Northern. Also, check out the entire lineup of our Diverse Perspectives in Digital Media and Design 2024 speaker series at dmd.uconn.edu/diverse. And don't forget to subscribe to us here on YouTube and follow our other social media channels at UConn DMD to see all of our department's great content. Thanks to our students and everyone who worked together to produce this great event. And most of all, thanks to all of you out there in our virtual audience for commenting, for raising questions, and joining us today. I hope that you are as inspired about Rachel's work as we are here in this Zoom room. There is work to be done, But if we continue to inspire and mentor our young creatives, together we can change this digital world and this actual world for the better. Good evening and good night.